I made two films. One was never released. The second one is the film that is being released. And when I went back, I realized that there was so much that I had seen and heard that where there wasn't a camera present, that the only way to make it understandable was by putting myself in the story. The other thing was that, you know, at the end of the day, the film is called The Armstrong Lie. It's about a lie, a big lie. And at some point, I had to reckon with the idea that the original film, which was to follow him during the comeback, so much of the footage was Armstrong lying to me personally, face to face. And so the idea of confronting that, and then also going back and confronting him and saying, you lied to me, now you have to try to tell me the truth. So that also was a kind of personal journey. So it seemed to make sense of this story, I had to put myself in it. I may be naive, but I wasn't stupid. So I did know about the allegations of doping with Armstrong, you know, going into the story. And I was trying to ask other people about it. But at the same time, I think one of the inevitable things that happened was that along the way, when you follow somebody and when you're so close to them day after day after day, you begin to root for them like a fan does. And so I rooted for Lance Armstrong in 2009. I thought he's coming back clean, he's trying to atone for what he had done in the past. And so to find out the magnitude of the lie and also the way in which he, you know, there was a disappointment for me, and I was pissed off, I was angry.
How far ahead were you in the editing of the other movie when things turned?
We were finished. We had mixed the film, and indeed, the narrator of the film then was Matt Damon, who we chose because he was originally going to play the part of Lance Armstrong in a fictional film that was to be produced by Frank Marshall, who was the producer of this film, a famous producer. So we got quite far in that film. And, you know, it is an interesting film. It's much more about cycling. It's about that journey of the year. And it does contain material about doping in the past. But it sort of accepts the idea that he was clean in 2009.
Were you surprised that Lance wanted to talk to you again and kind of participated to the second film in a way that, you know, gave you access to people that were never even have access before?
Yes, I was surprised that he talked to me the second time. But I think, in a way, two things happened. One was, I had spent a lot of time with him, so I had established a relationship and some sense of trust. I also think there was part of Lance that felt he owed it to me and to other people to try to make it right. And last, in a way, one of Lance Armstrong's great talents is as a writer. He's sort of the writer-creator of his own myth. And obviously, the myth of the perfect hero had taken a hit. That was a story that was just not believable anymore. But now there was another story. Maybe instead of wearing, you know, now he had gone from wearing the white hat to wearing the black hat. And I think he wanted to participate in order to maybe convey the message that there was shades of gray in the story. So I think he wanted to influence the story.
Was it hard to resist him? I mean, he's a very seductive character.
Look, on a personal level, on a day-to-day basis, I like him. But over time, you know, we ended up having, particularly after, you know, it was evident, and I knew before Oprah that he had doped because he had called me up and we had some conversations. The relationship became more honest and we could discuss things. And out of those discussions came some very odd realizations. I mean, it was very difficult for Lance to appreciate or understand the kind of damage that he had done to people. And how he had abused his power. All he was thinking about was going forward and winning. And winning you do, you know, it's winning at all costs. And I think that the interesting part of the discussions we would have is that I would then be more forceful and more honest with him and say, you know what? You know, you're acting like you're the victim here. You're not the victim here. And we'd have these sort of animated back and forth conversations where, as opposed to being the observer, I was sometimes in the role of confrontational therapist.
You've done film on Enron, on the Catholic Church, on Iraq, Afghanistan, and then you have done films about some very highly controversial individuals. The latest one was the WikiLeaks documentary about Assange. You did Jake Abramoff. Do you think there is a difference between the films you do about these people that are so full of shades of gray, there are sort of this sort of very opaque zone around them, and then the more straightforward reportage film you do about like a war or an army or a power structure?
I think in even the films I do about the power structures, I'm interested more generally in the perps, the perpetrators, than the victims. Of course, I'm concerned about the victims and their role, but even in a film like Taxi to the Dark Side, while the taxi driver at the heart of that film was the victim, nevertheless, I was very interested in the guards and the interrogators who had actually murdered him, because to understand, it's only by understanding the criminals that you can understand the crimes and you can figure out how to stop them in the future. And I think, in a way, the Lance Armstrong story started out as a kind of inspirational sports story, but I think it's also a story about an abuse of power and the way a public figure can lie not only to the media but also to all of us. And his lie is appreciated because it's delivered with such force. It's going behind the lie. And in some ways, that's similar to some of the other films I did, like Enron. Enron was pitched at one time as the salvation for capitalism. It was going to be the new kind of capitalism. Julian Assange was supposed to be the new future for a new kind of transparency. So I'm interested in kind of the going behind the myth, going behind the facade, and understanding what's ticking behind that. Armstrong has not seen the documentary yet. I made the deal with him, where I didn't make a deal, but I told him that he couldn't see it until the public had seen it, and the public sees it today. And the reason was I didn't want anybody to think that he had any influence in the editing of the film. But your question is also quite perceptive in another way. As you say, the quality of the images of the interview with Armstrong changed. One of the things that was interesting about the first film and the second film and how they became one is I went back and looked at the images for the first film when I was making the second film and realized that I had missed all sorts of things in those images that I should have seen the first time around. And one of those things I missed was his abilities his ability to spin the story and to lie. And there was a nuance and a new appreciation for what those images meant, going back in and seeing them. So it was very interesting to examine the images after the fact and see something in them I hadn't seen before.
So the documentary changed stylistically also changes stylistically a little bit in the second part.
It had to change stylistically, and we had to find a new way to represent the investigation. At the same time, there was I felt almost a desperate need also to retain an aspect of the earlier film, which I felt was still true, which was the idea of becoming involved in a sporting event. So we had a tremendous ability, we had tremendous resources in shooting the Tour de France and following, the race as it progressed. But part of the beauty of a lie, of the Armstrong lie, was his seduction of the fan in terms of rooting for him. And you can't really understand that until you see the power of the sport and how over time, so that I'm there on Mont Ventoux, and even though I'm supposed to be the objective filmmaker, I'm there rooting for my guy who I'm following, and I felt that was an important part of the movie to show.
There is, as an Italian, when I saw the film first, there is this one character, Michele Ferrari, that I found him stunning. Were you surprised that you were, not only that you were given access to him, but that he was so candid about it?
Yes, I was very surprised that I was given access, and actually, it happened in a rather funny way. I mean, Armstrong's whole entourage is very combative and very arrogant, and even in 2009, I mean, they were on top of the world. And so I asked one of Armstrong's people, I said, why is it that I can't talk to Michele Ferrari? And they said, who's saying you can't talk to Michele Ferrari? So next thing I knew, I was talking to Michele Ferrari. And I thought by reading about Ferrari that he was going to be this dark, you know, satanic figure, a kind of Dr. Frankenstein. And I was very surprised to see how charming he was. I went and spent the afternoon with him. We had Prosecco. You know, it was very interesting. And I think that Ferrari is very cynical about the whole world of doping. He just thinks, look, there are all these arbitrary rules, whatever. You know, one year they'll come up with this rule, you know, you can't take EPO, but you can sleep in an altitude tent. So he's very cynical about doping. But I think what people miss about Ferrari, and one of the things I tried to show in the film, was that his really only interest is as a scientist, and he looks at the human body like a machine. And how can you make the machine go faster? And how can you make the machine last longer? That's his pure interest. And he's not just a pharmacist who gives out drugs. He has a training program. He analyzes the biomechanics of the body. He figures out exactly how much food you're supposed to eat every day. So he became a much more interesting and fascinating character to me. It's also endlessly fascinating to me to see how some people who play roles that you think of as bad guy roles, when you meet them, they're rather charming individuals. And I found that certainly was the case with Michele Ferrari.
I don't paraphrase it correctly, but when Armstrong talks and says, yes, I'm guilty, I lie, but maybe in a different dimension, in a different time, I will not be considered. Do you think that things will change in sport where certain things just become acceptable and the norm?
You know, I hope that sort of, you know, that sports don't become laissez-faire. I mean, I think the problem with doping is that it becomes, as somebody says in the film, a story about power. You know, who has more resources, who has more technical know-how. So it's not a true test of athletic achievement. But I do think, you know, one of the dangers of the Armstrong story is that the cycling organization can feel good about itself. Oh, Armstrong is gone now, so all the problems are finished. You know, it's the classic scapegoat theory. It's what Rumsfeld and Cheney did with Abu Ghraib. They said, oh, there were just a few bad apples. So you punish the few bad apples, and then the system goes on as it did before. There was a celebration this year at the Tour de France, the 100th anniversary, and all the great champions were paraded, you know, at the Tour de France, except one, Armstrong. But I'll bet that if you had scientists test the blood samples of all those former champions, you would find a lot of drugs in those blood samples. But it's convenient now to say Armstrong was the bad one. You know, Robespierre liked to hit people out of history, you know, whenever they became inconvenient. I think it's, you know, as a historian, I'm offended when a sports organization tries to paint Armstrong out of history, because he's part of history, whether it may be a dark history, but nevertheless he's part of history. So some way, shape, or form, I think you have to reckon with that.
I have been told that we are run out of time. So I thank you very much for coming. I do thank mostly Alex for being here and for this great film.